Massive thank you, as always, to our top-tier patrons, Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ikoi, Hero, and myself host weekly live discussions. So come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron Danny.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
So I guess as a starting place, what is a definition of transference?
Transference is a subconsciously associating a person in the present with a past relationship. And counter-transference is responding to them with all the thoughts and feelings attached to that past relationship.
Well, I think one of the things that's involved in transference is a capacity that human beings have, and none of the other top primates have. No other animals have this, which is called mentalizing, which is that when you talk to another human being, you imagine that other human being, and you imagine how your words will be received by that other human being. And you can do that with one human being, or you can imagine a group of several human beings and imagine how your words will be received. That's a higher mental capacity on which transference is based, because you imagine that they're feeling the way you do, and it's often hard not to. I mean, one of the basic experiences of transference is if you have a baby. I mean, I've had 2 babies, and since they can't tell you what they want and what they need and how they feel about what you're doing, you have to guess from your own experience and your own sense of where they are and transfer onto them what you're feeling, because you don't have any other guide. They can cry or they can smile, but other than that, you don't have other guides. So that transference is not just a pathological thing. It's something we need in terms of mentalizing as a basic ability to imagine how another person feels. And also it's a basis of child rearing, so that it shouldn't. Transference and counter-transference, to my sensibility, are basic to human communication. I don't know how the 2 of you feel about it.
Oh, absolutely. I think, these transference and counter-transference is just basically, describing how we respond and make sense of our previous experiences and apply them to the present, right?
Right.
Way. So it's one of those things where, I think there's nothing wrong with transference. There's nothing wrong necessarily with counter-transference. It's just a question of when does it become counterproductive, because it's not always counterproductive.
It certainly can become counterproductive. I have a client for whom this saying really resonated, where he imagined his mother saying, "I'm cold, you need a sweater." Wait a minute.
Yeah.
It can go too far.
It's funny because my mom is very much like that. Where whenever she's cold, she starts telling me to you need to bundle up. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm burning up here. She's like, well, I'm cold. You're making me feel colder. Yeah.
Yeah. Because we don't have guides to other human beings. We can listen to their experiences, but at least according to Piagetian learning theory, what you do is you you digest knowledge the way you digest an apple. You take it into your system, you break it down so you can absorb that apple. And at the same time, the apple is transformed by being in your digestive system. So you take in knowledge and you kind of process it in terms of your own experience. And of course, you've changed their experience into yours. But it's inevitable in communication that they have to take it into themselves and make sense of it. And then, of course, it's changed.
I assume ultimately it's also about just assumptions, right? It's like a way of saving energy for your brain. You just, rather than question the thoughts or feelings that you're projecting onto other people, you just go, well, they are thinking or feeling this. And it's just a way of going about your day-to-day without using too much energy.
Yeah,
Maybe.
And also because language is improvisation. And so you can't stop and say, wait a minute, did you mean, how did you hear this word, that word, this sentence? Then the communication stops.
Right. So, yeah, I wanted to pick up on the thing you said right at the beginning there, Ikoi, that in counter-transference, the therapist then sort of plays a role of almost expectation of what the client expects from them. They start playing the role of the person that was being projected onto them. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right.
So how does that happen? How do they end up playing a role of a person they've never met or necessarily know that much about?
Well, the way they do it is based on their experience. So in a very dramatic incident of that, a client of mine wanted to ingratiate herself with me. And so she was lying there in these very seductive poses during the therapy because she wanted me to approve of her. And that's how she got approval from her father, who was an incest abuser. And then on the way out of the office, she tried to kiss me. And I said to her, don't worry, I won't let you do this and I won't reciprocate. You're safe here. Because I was saying you are projecting your past experiences on me, but my counter-transference is I see underneath that behavior a need for a safe boundary, and I'm providing it.
Right. So it's like a re-education.
Yeah, it is. It's saying that which you expect from your pathological background will not be forthcoming in this office.
Right.
And then you learn essentially a new way of being from that example.
That's right.
Right.
You do.
Right.
You learn from their different reaction from what you expected. I mean, I had a client who was in a very crazy place, and she said, I want you to watch me jump off your balcony. My balcony was on the second floor. And so I said, well, I would be afraid you'd injure yourself. How about you jump off the first step of the entrance? And if I notice you flying, then try the second and the third. And if you're still flying on the fifth step, then we can try the balcony. And she said, you just don't believe me. And I said, I just want you to be safe. And so she was sending out a transference. She was with somebody who goaded her into a lover who goaded her into pathological actions. And she was looking for a safe space. And so I transferred back onto her the need for safety.
Do you see this sort of stuff coming with a client, or like, I assume it's different for each person, but like, are you seeing it within the first session or first couple of sessions? Like, I can see the transference happening. I can see how this plays out. Is it, how does it, how does it work? Do you feel it? Do you sort of analytically detached and you can sort of examine certain bits and the puzzle pieces fit together? Like, how does it work?
Um, at least working with, my population, I often see it in the first session, just in terms of like, a lot of people understandably and justifiably have a lot of ambivalence at best, if not hostility
Right.
towards authority figures.
Right.
Right. So even if they are trying to be on their best behavior and tamp that under control, you get a very strong sense, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes from the first meeting about how they feel about authority figures.
Right.
Right. So it's not necessarily, how they feel about you as a counselor or Harriet as a therapist per se, but like, but how people react to authority figures. Yeah.
And how they process how they feel.
Yes.
I have a colleague who's a forensic psychiatrist and deals with recently released prisoners. And in the first session he had with someone, the guy pulled a gun on him and he thought, first he thought, oh no, I'm going to die. But then he thought, wait a minute, I'm a psychiatrist. And he said, oh, you must be feeling vulnerable. And the man said, yeah, and sat down and put the gun in his pocket. So that man transferred onto the psychiatrist a sense he was endangered and had to defend himself when he's in this office, to which he had been mandated.
Right. So do you have to be aware of your own sort of feeling state in these situations, because you realize, maybe the feelings that you're having aren't your feelings? Is that how it works?
Yeah, well, I think in this case, my colleague there at first just thought of his own feelings. Oh, Christ, I'm going to get killed.
But yeah, then, I'm in danger. I'm in danger, right? Yeah.
Right. But then he remembered he was a psychiatrist and looked at this person and thought, he feels vulnerable. I will help him. So you have to flip out of your own immediate transference onto this, meaning somebody has a gun, I'm going to get hurt, to someone has a gun as an extension of his terrified personality, I'm going to help him. It's, so that even if they project things on you, like that client who tried to kiss me, projected onto me her incestuous family, then I had to say, I will not respond to this. You are safe here.
Right. And how does that work in terms of your own mental energy? Do you, after a particularly challenging session, does this stuff linger with you? Like you're saying about you end up playing the role that this person wants you to play. Does that linger? Does that does it trouble you? Do you feel like you spend the rest of the day or a week or whatever just being like, ugh, like I don't feel like myself or something? Does that happen?
Doesn't happen to me. What happens is that then I know that this person tends to project, and that's quite usual with people who ingratiated themselves through incest in their families, that they will try to be seductive, and that I have to make it clear that they'll be protected and that isn't part of the bargain, without making them feel shameful or condemned. That person who tried to kiss me, the next session I said, I told you were safe. You tried to kiss me and you are safe here. And she said, oh, I had hoped you'd forget that. And I said, well, that's not something that I would forget. That's relevant about you. Let's look at why you thought that would be ingratiating. But I think it didn't disturb me. The gun might have disturbed me, but that wasn't my case. But it didn't disturb me because I walk into that office in a different role from the role I play in the rest of my life as a
Right.
kind of witness protector for people rather than a person reacting in friendship or the lack of it, you know?
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I think one of the it's one of the things that I've always said is that, empathy, especially in kind of a professional role like this, is a lot more of a cognitive process rather than an emotional process.
Yeah, because you have to
So
remember.
yeah, I mean, because a lot, yeah, I mean, one of the things about emotions is that it can really stop the mental process.
Hmm.
And we are there to provide that mental process, so fundamentally. So it's one of those things where, yeah, like, it doesn't really, I don't feel like, I think the stress of working with people is ultimately like, yeah, like, do I go home and like worry about some of my clients, or like do I continue to like occasionally think of like a client that I had and I'm like, oh, I wonder how they're doing, I hope they're okay.
Hmm.
Right, like I have these kinds of I guess responses to an ongoing responses of like a general concern of people's welfare.
I think
And
that's a brilliant definition you made and very important, that it's a cognitive process. It's not just an emotional process. Because if you think of that example from my colleague, at first it was an emotional process. Oh shit, I'm going to die,
right.
But
Well, I mean,
then he went into a cognitive process. What could this mean for this man?
right.
And that's different. Sorry.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that's I think really kind of misconstrued in in like I guess general society about what empathy is, because
Yeah.
people kind of understand empathy as an easy affinity. It's something that they can easily respond to, right? Um,
Yes.
versus empathy is actually about being able to harness a desire to understand situations that may be extremely challenging, extremely repellent, even like situations that you might, find like morally seriously questionable.
Yeah. And I think we're trained in that. I mean, I
Right.
think most children are trained to have empathy for their parents rather than themselves. And so they learn that the out of control parent is in trouble. And it's not just they who are hurting, it's the out of control parent, which is one of the reasons that children who are abused do better mentally than children who are totally neglected, because there is an interaction and there is an emotional contribution, and you can be empathetic to what someone is going through, even though what they're going through is not welcome. Like if somebody's trying to kiss you, you have empathy. I had empathy for her background of incest, and you can't be blinded by pity, so you don't see their effect at all. But you do have to be empathetic to the cause rather than the behavior that people exhibit if you're a therapist and mental health counselor.
Right.
And have you ever been thrown or sort of really sort of taken aback or puzzled by a sort of transference, like only afterwards, after the session, or some time to think about it, you go, oh, I get it, but at the time it just was really odd?
Yeah, you find yourself reacting during the session. I had a client once who, as soon as she walked through the door, she started crying. And by the time she sat down, tears were rolling from her face onto her chest.
Mm.
And it did take me aback a bit. because it set up this enormous grief. Where do you start with this? It was unusual, and it did take me aback. And sometimes somebody will be in an orgy of self-pity, and I find myself thinking, oh, come on, honey. You have a decent life. What are you doing? But then my own annoyance says to me, why am I annoyed?
Right.
What's going on here?
So there's a sense of always being vigilant about what's going on in your own brain, and that can be a clue. That can be part of the puzzle piece.
Yeah, it can, because, my annoyance is that for some reason, this person is sort of suppurating, sitting in the pus of self-pity for some reason. And in this case, this client she came from an utterly grim, miserable family, and she bonded with her family through being miserable.
Mm.
So it felt excessive because it was for her situation. But your own responses as a therapist give you a hint as to, wait a minute, I've got to examine this. What message am I getting? Do you find that also?
I think it really is important to be able to have a pause button in our own emotions, not to the point where like we become robotic.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's the fine line, right, of being in mental health is, how are we able to exercise our skills while not becoming like, completely dry and robotic and impersonal. And, so like, I do, sometimes I'll just be listening to a client talk about, a particular experience. And like, I've noticed that like, I'm kind of crying along with them. Right. And I don't necessarily think that those things are terrible or bad.
No.
But yeah, like it is kind of important to understand, like everyone has, a trigger. And I think this is especially something to note of, people that go into mental health, psychology, therapy, psychiatry, from like really, chaotic backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that for those of us that do come from a certain amount of dysfunction and chaos, that it is important to be able to not, transfer on to our clients.
Right.
Right. That is a really important thing to, or, and especially it doesn't necessarily have to be like, because a lot of times, chaotic experiences, people always assume that it's family. And it doesn't necessarily have to be family, right? In terms of like, drug treatment. Like I remember, during the course of my class, I was talking to a classmate, and the classmate was already working at the facility. And she was talking about how, she had a really, really hard time with one client because she reminded me of a really terrifying drug dealer and a bad drug deal experience that she had.
Mm.
And they had a really striking physical resemblance.
Ouch.
So, and it's also interesting, when people say like they have a striking resemblance, because after like talking to her for a while, I realized like they didn't necessarily look that much alike, but that they both had like the same exact red hairstyle.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
and every time, like, she would see her at work, like, her heart would kind of like sink, and like she can kind of feel like, anxiety well up inside herself. And she was like, man, like, I know this isn't the same person, but I can't help this response. And like, yeah.
Well, there's an awareness of the response, but also our empathy needs to go towards the suffering beneath the behavior. not necessarily the behavior, but the suffering underneath it.
Right.
And so that we don't just join them in whatever they're doing, but we try to see what they need. You try to go into the other person and figure out the need behind the speech, not only to take them at face value, because things, if you're a therapist or a mental health counselor, you don't take things at face value. You look at what's behind the mask that is often there.
Right. What is the unmet need?
Yes. What is the unmet need? How is it being expressed? How could it be comforted? How could it be resolved? Because you're there as a problem solver to help this person out of the bind they're in.
Absolutely.
And so basically when transference goes wrong, that seems to get forgotten or lost in the mix, that you're there to help instead.
That's right. You get too enmeshed.
Yes.
You can't, you can be compassionate, but you have to always keep a certain therapeutic distance that allows you to see the need behind the behavior and not get caught up in the behavior.
Right. So, the classic example of a terrible countertransference is, the therapist sleeping with a client is the classic negative, right? Countertransference.
Mm.
And not knowing the boundary and what's really healthiest for the client, but only listening to his own lust. I mean, which is a real problem, especially for psychiatrists who are male. They have the greatest incidence of this.
Is it it's sort of like a fairy tale thing, the hero and the princess, and you'll come in to save them kind of thing? Is there a danger of sort of believing your own hype, as it were?
Yeah, it can be. You can get a kind of messiah complex, or what they call savior behavior, and not understand the person has to you have to help the person save themselves, not you swoop in.
Right. Well, I think it's also one of those things where, I remember listening to a accounting of a psychologist that had fallen into that trap, and he no longer works in treating clients anymore. But one of the things about if you feel extraordinarily undesirable as a person, it's one of those things where, he had a really interesting take, which is if you feel extraordinarily undesirable as a person, you need to work on that before you go into the helping field.
Right. You need to keep working on yourself. It's what Freud said, physician, heal thyself. And unfortunately for our profession, which of course has as many people who are inept as any other profession, but a lot of people go into it to reassure themselves that they're not the crazy one, and they don't look at themselves. So they're not very helpful.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's one of, he was in his accounting, he seemed like a very classic case of, a very neglected child that wanted to go into a helping field, because of his, experience with neglect from both his father and mother.
Right.
But unfortunately, that those noble intents can be blinding.
Mm.
And I think that is one of the reasons why I often talk so much about, so much harm in society, often coming from a good place, or often coming from wanting to protect. Right. So in his case, he had a very deep-seated issue with, feeling worthy or feeling desirable at all. And being a therapist, to a certain degree, was something that brought him a sense of value. to himself, but at the same time, it was also an area where he really hadn't resolved his, issues with desirability or self-worth.
And also didn't seem to be working on them.
No.
Because, we do on some level have to be involved. So if somebody has been misdiagnosed and is taking some kind of horrible psych med that's altering their behavior, we have to help them to find a psychiatrist who will see if this is necessary. And if it isn't, slowly wean them and safely wean them off. And that's something we ought to do outside of the usual, not go to their house or anything, but there are real helps that we need to do. I have a client who is trying to regain her life after being in a terrible abusive relationship. And it was important that I hook her up with a lawyer so that she could get protections. I think some of the ways we should extend ourselves, but we can't get so emotionally involved that we lose all perspective and our role as the person who helps you see rather than who solves for you.
And so, and so do you, or have you in the past then also gone to see a therapist to make sure that you're staying
yes,
measured or whatever?
Absolutely. Right. In fact, in France, you have to be in therapy at least once in every 5 years to get your license as a psychotherapist or psychiatrist, because you ought to know what's your stuff and what's your clients. And I think that's very sensible. I think it should be mandated.
I agree. I just, I am in the position where I have never really been able to afford a therapist.
Yeah, that's awful. That's the awful part of being unemployed or employed in a field that's ultimately terribly valuable and yet underpaid.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting how many social workers also fall into this category.
Absolutely.
I was talking to a social worker a couple months ago, and she was just like, "Oh, I was like, well, hopefully you have a therapist." And she was like, "I've never been able to afford one," and I was like, "Same here."
Right.
I mean, it's one of those things where I guess Medicaid to a certain degree does provide for, but there are long wait lists and whatnot.
Well, it sounds to me like a fundamental problem, structural problem with the sort of the mental health field, right? Like if part of the thing about mental health is that at the end of the process you're somehow supposed to be healthier, if the people involved in that process don't also have access to the same thing.
Right.
That's huge.
Well, it's the most huge in a market-driven healthcare system,
right?
Like we have.
Well, we literally do not. Yeah, we don't have the number of. Just in terms of number of people, number of therapists available to the need, we don't have enough. We're not even close to having enough, and one of the major issues in terms of a lot of mental health professional training is that a lot of internships are not necessarily paid.
Yes, that's true.
Or they're not paid well enough for people to
live on,
commit to.
That's right.
Even I know several people who went through the entire, whether it's MFT program or at least the school learning portion of it, and then ultimately did not get a license because they weren't able to meet the internship aspect.
That's all the part of a market-driven healthcare system, which we have here. I would imagine, and Liam, you would know this, hopefully, that it would be different in a public healthcare system.
The NHS is, from what I know, horrible.
Well, I'm just a layman and I don't have the sort of exposure to that kind of stuff, but it would potentially make for an interesting guest.
Yes.
But yes, just imagine, mental health chatbot has entered the chat when you don't have the resources for your own therapist. Suddenly, the AI chatbots turn up and like, tell me about your problems. Oh, really?
Right.
Etc. That would be the dystopian plaster fix to the issue. As a sort of more potentially dead end, but maybe abstract version of transference, like how does transference exist in society or outside of the therapist's context? Like, does it exist in a sort of broader sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the most common transference is, probably something that's rife in society, right? Which is that, like, this kind of assumption that people should have the same values, priorities, and decisions that I make.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like that's the most common one that, generally exists. And it's the most common reason for like a huge majority of conflicts within society.
But you also, everyone has to observe some kind of transference in order to get along with anyone. And when it works,
absolutely.
It really is magical. I mean, I was walking by in my neighborhood. 14th Street is a huge cross street in New York. And there was a woman sitting against the wall, and she looked like she was really in trouble. It was a Black woman, and she was nicely dressed and stuff, but she looked like she was having some real trouble. And there were some cops around her, but they weren't menacing. They were on their cell phones trying to get her some help, I think. And she looked so sad. And she reached me emotionally through her look, and I looked at her and I waved at her, and she blew me a kiss as we walked by, because somehow I projected onto her, how would I feel slumped against a building with strangers trying to help me? Oh my God. So there is that transference in everyday life. And it's essential to every job. You always have to go beyond the job description to what's actually needed. And in France, one of the things that really impressed me, because they have a much stronger and more militant labor movement than we do, is that when the university workers went on strike when I was there, what they did was only do their job description, and everything ground to a halt. Because there's emotional labor involved in feeling what's needed and providing it, rather than looking at the letter of the law and doing only that. We all need to transfer the needs of the job, transfer from ourselves the needs of the job or the needs of the people on the job.
Right.
We have to.
I mean, transference to a certain degree is like, kind of understanding like basic, nonverbal cues.
Yes, it is.
Right. That is a huge part of, like it's one of those things where like if somebody is frowning, it's not necessarily insane to, sit there and go, oh, like, is that person having a tough time with something? It may not necessarily be so, right? They just could have that kind of, resting bitch face as a general standard expression that they have, but to say like, oh, hey, like, can are you
okay?
Are you okay? Right? Can I help you out? Like, especially if they're in the middle of a task and you're in a workplace and someone's, got their face scrunched up, it's like, hey, like, can you, do you need, can I help you out with this task, or are you okay? Right? Like those kinds of, understanding basic emotional, expressions.
Cues. Yeah, we all have to get cues based on our knowledge, and that is transference.
Yes.
And in a therapeutic situation, there's a kind of transference where you feel the person's issue, but you also try to identify with the cause of that issue and address the motive behind it rather than just the behavior, like that example with my friend, the psychiatrist. The motive behind taking out that gun was not enmity and he was going to shoot that psychiatrist, but rather that he felt vulnerable and he needed a defense.
Right.
And that was a very dramatic incident.
I worked at residential facilities can see a lot more distress behaviors in some ways than outpatients.
Yes.
And since I worked at a residential facility, it can be a huge shift to go whether you were homeless or whether you were housing insecure or whether you had your own place, right? To kind of uproot yourself and come to a residential facility is a big deal. Psychologically, emotionally, so it's one of those things, or and I've seen some like really, really, big meltdowns from people, which is understandable, right? Like
sure.
if I was, severely impacted by those meltdowns, I couldn't do my job. You have to be
That's
like,
right.
oh yeah, like this is, somebody going through a major shift.
That's right. And you're looking at underneath, you're looking at the rehabilitative need of that person,
right?
Not just getting unsettled by the behavior, even if it can be unsettling.
Right.
You try to figure out the emotion behind it and try to address what's happening.
Right. And so, a lot of times, within these kinds of situations, it's also just like sometimes you have to just let people have, a moment to get things out.
Right.
Because
just be a witness. That's right.
Because one of the things that often happens in these situations is like people resort to, hey, calm down.
Right. Which isn't fair because people sometimes they need a release and they need to be witnessed in their sorrow.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes people just need to like get out their frustrations, right? They don't, because oftentimes like I'm just like, hey, like, do you want me around? Do you not want me around? Like, right. What and a lot of times people do, but not necessarily, but it's like I'll just like take people into the office and be like, hey, like if you want to scream as much as you want.
Right.
I guess
you won't be scared.
It must just take us an enormous amount of concentration and energy to not get wrapped up in transference, because I'm just thinking about personal relationships and stuff. Just it's very difficult to not be how do you know if these things that you're reacting to are or authentic, or like that you are now sort of being put in a position where you're now it's like that unconscious contract stuff that happens in the same way that you're talking about that this counter-transference, you end up playing the role of the person that the client wants you to play. That happens in personal relationships as well, like all their sort of past experiences or yours, you suddenly are putting onto this other person. So I can imagine, for an hour with a client, like you can be really switched on. But then, when it comes to sort of home time, like it must just be exhausting to like be in that mode all the time. Because are they is it transferable as a skill? Like, are you able to sort of take this knowledge about transference and bring it into your own personal relationships and be like, oh yeah,
I think you can, only if you've done the work to understand that your feelings and your reactions may not be shared. So that I remember getting very annoyed because I was talking to my husband about something important to me, and he was sorting out pills, and that's fine. Then he left the room, and I thought, that asshole, what is he doing walking out when I'm talking about something important. Then I thought, well, let's see what it means to him. So I said, why did you walk out? He said, well, there was nothing else to do. And I said, well, it's something important to do, to listen to people. He said, oh, yeah, and came back in. He had been trained that you always have to do something and that listening to someone else is not doing enough because we're different. It's understanding the difference. And I think the more you know yourself, the more you know that other people are different from you. And that's the hardest thing, at least in intimate relationships, to know that the other person is actually other. They're not you, and they have distinctive reactions that have to be understood and that can be learned. But you can be so self-absorbed in your own thing that you interpret it to mean what you would have meant.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I also, and this is a side, and perhaps maybe I'll cut it out. Like, whether it's relationships or whether it's even in a work context or maybe in a sort of more informal context with friends or strangers, I have sometimes felt in the presence of XYZ person disturbed, right? And it's like that wasn't there before, but because of this person being in the same room, I feel uncomfortable for whatever reason, or I feel troubled. And that is like, is that really to do with me? Because I was fine before, and now I'm in the room with this person,
Well, you can pick up all sorts of things that are not conscious, but energy emerging from a person that is disturbed energy and is unsettling, because we have so much more perceptive capacity than we ever know that we have.
Right. Well, and a lot of times, like, whenever I get feelings like that, because I get feelings like that, from time to time, right? One of the things that I often also have to keep in mind is that, like, a lot of us are just incompatible. That doesn't mean they're bad people. That I could
That's
just
true.
sensing onto an incompatibility, right? Because I remember walking into a workplace and, just getting like this really kind of like, feeling from, this brand new coworker that I've never met before, and it wasn't really that she was a bad person. It's just that she was just one of those people that, had that was really passive aggressive. And there was nothing passive aggressive necessarily about her initial encounter, right? But that was probably kind of what I was picking up on, and I just kind of had to be like, what, we're just like really incompatible. This is not, something that I'm compatible with, and leave it at that, right? Because in other ways, aside from her passive aggressiveness, in other ways, like, in her best moments, she was an extraordinarily helpful coworker too. So it was just one of those things where I had to figure out what was the best response coming out from me so that I can bring out that side of her.
Right.
And not the other, negative aspect that was, that I had a very hard time tolerating, So sometimes, it's just one of those things where we are not necessarily meant to get along with everybody.
No, but we have the
okay.
discipline to adjust. But I can walk down the street in New York, and my daughter is great at picking up people's energy, and she can see a block away. Let's get out of his way. Because somebody's giving off rageful energy. And we pick up much more than we ever know we know. We know so much more than we ever allow ourselves to be conscious of. And so these feelings are at least instructive. Why do I find this person abhorrent? Yeah.
Right. They are absolutely instructive. I think, anyone that's dealt with like a really, emotionally trigger hair type of parent, right, can tell you, like, because my dad was very, very, not emotionally regulated. But I could tell his mood from like the minute his car hit the driveway.
Yeah.
Right. Before he even stepped foot in the house, I would hear the car and I could guess what, it's like, oh shit, do I need to make myself very invisible?
Right.
Right. Or like, can I actually like go out and attempt some interaction? Right. And it got to a point where like I was never wrong after a certain point.
Right. A finely tuned instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do pick up so much more than we know. And, if you're in a long-term relationship with a person who you slowly get to know, you understand that you were drawn to that person for a depth of reasons you had no idea, or you were repelled by that person. You usually don't get to know them very well. But people to whom you're romantically inclined, if you get to know them deeply, you understand it on levels you never knew when you just liked them,
Right,
yeah.
Because we don't know how that works.
Yeah. I mean, in that way, like I listen to my instincts, but I don't just depend on them. I try and give people a certain benefit of the doubt, right? Just in terms of like, like how can I make, and I think it is especially important in like, if you're doing a lot of organization or activism, that, we try and be kind to our cohorts, right?
That's right. And yet there are some to whom we really are attuned and others to whom we want to work. We want to connect with them as workers, but no more.
Right. And
based on projection. Fine. It's fine, but it's based on a kind of transference and a whole set of sensitivities of which we're not aware.
Right.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Belmas, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.